Messiah, this month, from my point of view, this is the last opportunity I have to give a shiur in this wonderful chabura, and next week is Ben Azmanim, and I will really miss you all. And Baruch Hashem, we'll see each other b'siyata d'shmaya, be'ezes Hashem yisborach in Chodesh Elul, and when we will learn different sugyas. I understand we might be learning Hilchos Shofar, but it was a wonderful experience to be oisik in Hilchos Challah. And the topic we will be discussing today is one of the most complicated topics in Halacha, and that is Shiur on Shil Torah. And when I learned this sugya be'iyun, I came up with a mahalach, and I was amazed that in a sugya in which all the greatest minds, all the gedolim, had their say, b'chol zois nerelani es daiti shemukim enichol min hashomayim lehisgador, and with the new mahalach in Geder of Shiurei Torah. So this is one of the more complicated sugyas, and I really don't know. If you learned my tshuva, and I know that some of you did, I don't know whether I'll have very much to add on today, but maybe just to do chazorah and go through it again, and befrat hanerelani es daiti. So the Chazon Ish wrote the Kuntres HaShiurim, Mordechai Semelamed Tes, which is an amazing Kuntres, and the Chazon Ish is very powerful with what he writes, and Reb Chaim Noah was one of the Chachmei Yerushalayim, a gewaltige Talmud Chochem, wrote his Sefer Shiurei Torah, and he comes to justify and to be Melamed Zchus on the Minhag, and I think Reb Chaim Noah actually gives voice to the more common minhag, and the Stipler came out against Reb Chaim Noah to justify the Chazon Ish in his sefer. So first a brief summary of Yesodas Advorim, and I think the sugya starts off in the Mishnah and Kollel Daf Perek Yud Zayin Mishnah Vav. Kebeitze she'amru, loy godel v'loy koton ele beinoini. How do we define a Beitza Benoni? Rabbi Yehuda says you bring a big one and you bring a small one, and you put them in a kli of water, and how much water comes out, and then you split it in half. Rabbi Yossi says that's complicated and doesn't get you anywhere, because you still would ask, what's a Beitza Gedola? Godel Shel Gedola? What's a Beitza Ktana? A tiny one or a small one? What's a Beitza Gedola? A huge one or a big one? An elephant's beitza? I don't think elephants lay eggs, but or a mouse's beitza. How do we define a godel and a koton? So Rabbi Yossi says, "Lefi da'atoi shel roya," and that's an amazing statement which we will try to understand today. But the Rambam paskins, "Halacha ke Rabbi Yossi lefi da'atoi shel roya," which essentially means experience, mitzias advorim, human experience. Any person that has hens and sells eggs will tell you what's a Beitza Beinonis, more or less. So this brings us to, first of all, a philosophical question. When I say philosophical, I mean Ashkofes HaTorah. Are shiurim meant to be exact, or are shiurim somewhat more or less? Are shiurim meant to be exact? Because when you only learn the Mishnah and Kollel, your impression is, doesn't have to be meduyak. What does Da'atoi Shel Roya mean? If it's Da'atoi Shel Roya, we can never really know. But l'chayre, Da'atoi Shel Roya goes against the Gemara 3 times in Bali, in Menachos Gimel and Rosh Hashanah Yud Gimel and Iksubis. Kol midas chachomim kachem. Mem so metaharin, mem so choser kortov eino metaharin. Beitza, tmeitu mesoichlin. Choser sumsum. Sumsum is sesame seeds, tiny little seeds. A beitza choser sumsum eino metame. Gimel al gimel metame tumis begodem. Choser nimo, one thread eino metame. So this Gemara says, take this seriously. Shiurim are shiurim, and you have gimel al gimel etzbois or gimel al gimel tvochem. One thread is missing, you don't have a shiur. Beitza, but if there's like a sesame seed missing, then you don't have a beitza. Lo yotze yadei chavosai. And, you know, Tara b'mikveh incurs krisis. Thomas shenechnas lemikdash chayiv koreis. And if it's chosek kortov, chosek mashu, it's eino mitayah. So how do we reconcile Dante Sharoya, Tzorach Loimar? The way to determine the Shiur is Dante Sharoya. But once the Shiur was determined, it becomes fixed. And it must be so, because the etzem musag, the etzem concept of a Shiur means that it's not more or less. More or less, you can't call that a Shiur. So yes. How do we determine a Shiur? Da'atei Sharoya. Because there's no other way. But once you determine a Shiur, that is a Shiur. And it gets a life of itself, and it's chosek kolshu, then it's lat metam. And this is a very yesodistic observation. So the Mishnah says, Da'atei Sharoya. Chazanish Lametes, Oizavav, quotes Shuvas HaGaonim. And this Shuvas HaGaonim is the earliest source, and maybe the most important source, because Shuvas HaGaonim tackles this dilemma b'yesodai. And Shuvas HaGaonim explains, why are all the shiurim based on things that are natural, hazeisim v'habeitzim? And why don't Chazal say grams, centimeters? Because Dinei Torah must endure time and space. The Torah was given for eternity. Misha Omer v'hoyo olam noisan Torah knew that our experiences will span thousands of years and thousands of miles and kilometers. And we will be dispersed throughout the world. Different cultures, different languages, different generations, different times. So how could we adhere to shiurim l'netzach? So in America it's pounds, and in the entire world it is kilograms. In America it's miles, and the entire world talks about meters and not feet, and centimeters and not inches. And today it's a connected world. How would we know how much was a gram turkey 100 years ago in Yerushalayim, or other types of shiurim? And that is why Chazal fixed the shiurim to zeisim, to beitzim, because eino mishtanim li'olam. When the Gaonim said eino mishtanim li'olam, did they mean that the eggs for eternity will be the same size and the zeisim will be the same size? Maybe so. So in my sefer, when I dealt with shiurim, I bechavona did not want to quote archaeology, because I think the halachic process should be a halachic process al taharas ha'torah. But in Eretz Yisrael, hundreds, maybe thousands of pits of olives were found in excavations. And according to the mumchim, archaeologists and scientists, those pits are 1,000 years old. Some of them go back 2,000 years, and they're the same size as the pits of Zeisim Bismaneim. So this L'choira proves that Zeisim more or less are the same size. It is unreasonable to say that the pit is the same size, but maybe the Bosar Hazayas was drastically different than the pit. Maybe. But the Bosar, the flesh of the Zayas, rots in a few days. So what was preserved is the pits, which are more time and climate enduring. But anyway, the Gaonim explain, and the Chazanish wholeheartedly embraces the svara of the Gaonim. Shiurei Torah were attached and associated with natural phenomena, Beitzim, Zeisim. And I say the same, the entire system of Shiurei Oirech, which is Etzba, Omo is the forearm, Etzba is the finger, Agudal, and other Shiurim. Why not centimeters, inches? Because centimeters and inches might be forgotten. Different cultures, thousands of years will pass, and that is why the Shiurim were associated with human body parts, with human limbs. We should be able to be mishai b'kol mokum u'b'kol zman. So the Gaonim do not say that the Etzba and the Ummah will never change. Now, do they say clearly that the Beitz and the Zaysim will never change? But what they do say is that they shall roya. So if 1,000 years from now you will need to know how much matzah do we need to eat B'leil Pesach, you look at a Zayis, and that is the Shiur. And if you will need to know how much do you need to eat in Sukkah, and what are your mutter to eat now, you look at a Beitza and you say Kebeitza Void, V'kach B'kol Doya V'Doya. So that is the Tshuvas HaGa'onim quoted by the Chazon Ish. Things become complicated. In Psochim Kuf Tesam Adalef, when Rav Chisda comes along and he compares two different systems. Because in Chazal we find Shiurei Nefach. Nefach means quantity. What is the translation? Volume. Shiurei Nefach. Zayis, Beitze, Groigeres, Koiseves. They are volume. And then we have an entire system, Shiurei Oirech. Oirech is length. How would we say Oirech? Length. Which is Etzba, Amo, Tefach, Zeres. They are Shiurei Oirech. Comes along Rav Chisda, Dav Kuf Tesam Adalef, and he says, Revi'es Shel Torah is Etzba al Etzba, Barom Etzba Ayim, V'chotzi V'choimish. So he's the first one that makes a comparison, Revi'es and fingers. Etzba, Shiurei Oirech. Revi'es, Shiurim of volume. And based on Rav Chisda, in that same Gemara, Memso, Mikveh is Amo al Amo, Barom Gimel Amis. When you have a cube, Amma long, Amma wide, and the height Gimel Amis, that is Memso Shel Torah. And so in Hilchos Chala, Yordei Shin Chof Aleph, based on the Mishnah, Mesechet Chala, Perik Bais, Mishnah Vav, Mem Gimel Beitzim. What is Mem Gimel Beitzim? Eser Etzbois, Al Etzer Abois, Barom Gimel Etzbois. Or, if you want to make a square, it is Zayin Etzbois, a cube, right? Zayin Etzbois cube, Pochas, Shtei Tishiyos. So that is Shiur Chala. And what I just said is the combination. Shin Chov Daled Yodeh, Tufrun Vav, Orachayim. Ritzlach, 200 years ago. Tzlach HaMesechet Psochim Dav Kuf Tes. Tzlach says, I checked this out, and all the Achronim followed the Tzlach. And the Tzlach said, I found a tremendous discrepancy. Because the Tzlach was the Rov in Prague. The Tosis Yom Tov was the Rov in Prague 200 years earlier. And in the Bais Din of Prague, they had a Kli, which the Tosis Yom Tov measured. He actually built that Kli, and it contained Mem and Gimel Beitzim. And for hundreds of years, in Kehelas Prague, from the time of the Tosis Yom Tov, that was the Shiur Chala, based on the Kli of the Tosis Yom Tov. The Tzlach checked it out with its boys, and he find, based on Shiur Chala of its boys, Zayin its boys, a cube of 7 is almost twice as the Shiur of the Kli of the Tosis Yom Tov, Mem Gimel Beitzim, almost a double quantity. So the Tzlach says, what are we supposed to do? The conclusion of the Tzlach was, Niskatnu HaBeitzim, and we need to double all the Shiurim, the entire system. We need to double the Zaysim. Because in Tov Pevav and Orachayim there are two shittas. The Mechaber Maskins, the Zayis is a Chotzi Beitz. Mishnah Brur brings the Rambam, Zayis is Shlish Beitz. The Duraisa were Machmir, the Rabbanah were Mekel. Tov Pevav. So, if the Beitzim in early days, the Beitzim of yore were twice the size of our Beitzim, we need to double the Shiur Zayis as well. That is what the Tzlach says. The entire system of volume Shiurim have to be doubled. So the Blazer Fleckels, and the Chazon Ish quotes him, the Blazer Fleckels writes that when the Tzlach came up with his idea, and he discussed it in his Bais Din, the Blazer Fleckels, who was a Talmud of the Tzlach, Shalos Tshuvas Shuvim Yahava, suggested to his Rebbe, and he said, the Tzlach was a very big person, very impressive figure. So he told his Rebbe, you're so big, maybe your fingers are far bigger than fingers of other people. So you're measured with your fingers. Maybe your fingers are too big. And the Tzlach smiled. And the Brother Fleckles says, I think he agreed to my argument. And that was my impression. And the Chazon Ish says, you're out of your mind. He laughed at you. You're so silly to make such a stupid suggestion. So the Chazon Ish says, you misinterpreted his amusement. He was very amused by what you said. So the Chazon Ish says, if the Tzlach would accept his interpretation, then he would come out the other day with Shabbos pamphlets, with the internet, wherever it is, and say, I regret, and I want to make a mitzvah for Klal Yisrael. So the Chazon Ish staunchly stands behind the Shiurim of the Tzlach. The Tzlach's opinion made a huge stir and an impression in the Halacha world, because the Noida B'Yehuda was the Pesach Adar. And in Masarav, it is quoted that the Gra accepted the opinion of the Tzlach that we need to double the Shiurim. Chasam Soifer, Chuvas Orchaim Simen Kuf Chov Zayin, the Bais Ephraim was one of the great poskim of the generation, one generation after the Tzlach, together with the Chasam Soifer and the Gra was somewhat older. Rosh Ephraim al Yoredeya, Gimel Tet Zayin, and the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish in our time supported the Shiurim of the Tzlach. Reb Chaim Noah was in a very unpleasant situation, coming out against the Chazon Ish and against the Tzlach and all those Gedolim that supported the Tzlach. But Reb Chaim Noah, I think it was a tzaddik, and he argued, this is the minig. It's not only minig, it's the Shulchan Aruch at the end of the day. The Shulchan Aruch speaks about Mem Gimel Beitzim. And it's the Tosas Yom Tov. After all, the Tzlach does away with the Tosas Yom Tov. Would we say that Niskatnu Beitzim, when exactly? When exactly? So, between the Rishonim and the Tosas Yom Tov, between the Shulchan Aruch and the Tosas Yom Tov, the Tosas Yom Tov was a contemporary of the Beis Yosef. They were in the same generation. So the Beis Yosef speaks about Beitzim, and the Tosas Yom Tov measured out those Beitzim. So actually, Reb Chaim Noah reflects the Shulchan Aruch. It's not Reb Chaim Noah. He reflects the Shulchan Aruch. Because the Tosas Yom Tov is based on the Beitzim of the Shulchan Aruch. So Reb Chaim Noah is actually Shulchan Aruch, and the Minchas Baruch. But how do they solve the problem, the discrepancy? The discrepancy is real. So Reb Chaim Noah says, if we want to compare the Beitzah with the Etzbois and justify Zion Etzbois, a cube of Zion Etzbois, Pucha Shtei Chiyos, should fit in with the Beitzim, then the Etzbois must be 2 centimeters. But the average width of the Etzba is 2.2 or 2.4 centimeters, somewhere between. So Chaim Noah suggests one of 3 approaches. V'mi she'ekdim et Reb Chaim Noah is the Minchas Baruch, and the Chazon Ish writes very big on the Minchas Baruch. Siman Ayin A was one of the great Gedolim in Lit. Either we're talking about its voice, which you squeeze together, you apply pressure. So the etzba is a bone, the width, but there also is some flesh. So when you need to put Zion its voice, it's Zion its voice pressed together. Or maybe we mean this pedic, not that one. My fingers are the same, very small difference. Some people, the second digit of the thumb is wider than the first digit. Or maybe it's not this, it's this. Oivi etzba is, roichev etzba doesn't mean this, it means this. So these are ideas. How could we reconcile the obvious two? And Reb Chaim Noah was a tzaddik, and his Sefer Shiur Mikvi printed a letter that he got from the Chazon Ish, a letter in which the Chazon Ish bashes him, but he printed it in his Sefer. And the Chazon Ish writes there, so typical for the Chazon Ish, that what is makubal, that a etzba is this, not this, and not this, is such a svara pshuta, we could be mater and eishes ish with this svara. That's what the Chazon Ish writes. So tikbar of the Chazon Ish. He writes, what you suggest is so unreasonable, I would be mater ha'eshes ish. I don't know what Sofik edition could depend on Roicha Vetzva. Harayat Mikadeshes li al menash Roicha Vetzva u 2 centimeter psik 2 V'holcha v'nisas la'acher the Shabadin of an Eshes ish is in so or not. But that's how clear the Chazon Ish rejects Reb Chaim. What?
I get
Okay, that's very good. Yeah. Because the Amma depends on the Etzba. Because the Tefa depends on the Etzba. And the Amma depends on the Tefa. Okay? So these are the two basic approaches. How do we deal with the stira that we find in Shiur? Now, in my Sefer, I brought a list of Gedolei Yisrael throughout the ages, in which it seems to be Poshut Midivreim in Shiur Zayis that Ein Lacha Ela Zayis Shebiyumechu. What the Chazon Ish quotes from Tshuvas HaGoyim. Chut HaShoni, not Chut Shoni. Chut HaShoni is the Chavis Shiur. He wrote three amazing forms. Tshuvas Chavis Shiur, Tshuvas Chut HaShoni. Simen Tzadik Zayin. Yad Eliyahu, Rabbi Eliyahu Ragolar, who was a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, Talmud Talmidoi Shel HaGoyim. And a Simachov Poshit B'Dvorav, that a Zayis is, you just look at a Zayis in every day and age. Zera Emes was one of the great Gedolim, Sephardi Gedolim, Yodei Simen Tzadik. And what we see B'Divreim is exactly what we see in Shuvas HaGoyim quoted by the Chazon Ish. What is very confusing is Masarav, that is the most reliable Sefer on Minhagei HaGoyim, written by his Talmidim, who are Mishamishim, and a Masarav, they say that the Goyim followed the Tzlach. But Minhagei Reb Chaim Volozhin, there are various different Sforim. Minhagei Reb Chaim Volozhin, Sharei Rachamim, Ois Nun Aleph and Ois Kuf Samachei. Ois Nun Aleph, they deal with Kiddush B'Mukim Suda. And they write that Reb Chaim Volozhin said Kiddush B'Mukim Suda is a shlish kaf. That means a third of a tablespoon. He's not dealing with spoons that are made for serving, but a third of a tablespoon. The Shiur Kazayis of Chazon Ish would never fit into the third of a tablespoon. And a Kuf Samachei, it's quoted from Rabbi Yosef Mislutsk, who was one of the Choshev Talmidim of Reb Chaim Volozhin, so you mekel ma'oid b'shiyah zayis. The Netziv was an article of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. There's an amazing letter in Chidush HaNetziv Mesechet Psochim, Daf Lamed Tes. Daf Lamed Tes is the Mishnah of Moroyer, Shiur Moroy Kazayis. And in Chidush HaNetziv, Moroy Mesod HaRashas, they printed a letter that the Netziv wrote to his son, Reb Chaim Berlin. Was the Rav in Moscow, one of the Gedolei Yisrael. And then Netziv writes, I heard that you're machmer b'shiyah zayis b'moroyer, and I want you to know you shouldn't do that. It's a mistake because it's a sakana. And the shir kazayis hamavur b'shulchan aruch hu koten b'yoysa. So then Netziv doesn't write how big it is. But what we learn from this Netziv, shir zayis mavur b'shulchan aruch. And that is Tov Pei Vav. That is where it's Mavur b'Chosachon. The Chosachon says, Chotzi Beitze. And it's a Shir Koten B'Yoyso. That is what the Netziv writes. That is the Lashon of the Netziv. Avnei Nezer, and this is a Eidus, I think, that comes from Reb Shlomo Zalman and not before. So Reb Shlomo Zalman heard from Reb Shlomo Kalish, who was the son-in-law of the Chelkas Yoyav. Chelkas Yoyav was a Talmud Chover to the Avnei Nezer. And the Chelkas Yoyav was made that he heard from the Avnei Nezer Legabe Matzah. One asked him, what is the Shir Zayis? And he stuck out his finger. And he pointed close to the fingernail. That means the digit of his finger. And he said, this is a Kazayis. My fingers are not very big. Maybe the Noida B'Yehuda's fingers were bigger. But this is actually a small zayis. But So many Gedolim assumed halacha l'maisa throughout the ages that Azayas is more or less Azayas, and that fits in with the Gaonim. Rabbi Yossi, lefidat sharoya. It is a certain harchava of the Mishnah in Kollel, because the Mishnah in Kollel speaks about how do we know what's a Beinoni, not big, not small. So, in contrast to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that we need to do something scientific, a big one and a small one, and put them into a kli, Rabbi Yossi says, no, estimate. Lefidat sharoya. So the Mishnah doesn't clearly speak lefidat sharoya for eternity. That is the Tshuvas HaGaonim. But it's based on the same Hagdara. Dato sharoya shebekol zman v'zman. And as I brought many sources, that was the accepted interpretation throughout the Doyas. An important Nakuda, I was marchiv in my Sefer, and I was not aware whether the Achronim bring these sources or not. I know that does the Chazanish bring the Afkas Loichel, or only the Chazanish or the Stipler? I think of Chaim Noah, the Stipler, the Chazanish doesn't quote him. But we find two sources that go back hundreds of years that already realized the steer between the Divrei Shiur. And both are dealing with mikvois, not with challah. So, the Tzlach found a discrepancy dealing with challah. But in Tshuvas HaTashbetz Chelek Gimel Simalamed Gimel, he writes that when you measure Amor al Amor, Beroim Gimel Amis, it is far more volume than Memso based on Beitzim. And the Tashbetz writes, when we have a stira, we need to go to Chumrah. So the Tashbetz did not try to come up with a formula to be miyashiv, contrary to both the Chazanish and Reb Chaim. The Tashbetz was aware of the stira, but it did not try to be miyashiv. And I understand that, because every solution we try to suggest is problematic. Chazanish says, Niskapnu abeitzim. Maybe Niskapnu gamet's voice. So how do we know? How do we know what to do? The Chazanish writes, it's not mistaver that Nisgago its voice, but it's Medirei Chazal mashma that people become smaller and smaller. Dafka in archaeology and anthropology, at least the last 2,000 years, and I don't want to speak about Shitosam, but the human body today seems to be substantially bigger, and people are taller than they were 1,000 years ago. So obviously, Oig Melech HaBoshan and even Moshe Rabbeinu were taller than we were, according to Chazal. Maybe those were Yechidim, maybe something happened, and 3,000-4,000 years ago, people were huge, then they became small, and today they've become somewhat taller. We don't know. But we do know that different races have different body parts. Asians, Lamoshel, are shorter than Caucasians, but their fingers are thicker. So, how do we know what an etzba is? Imloi shenoimar lefi data shenoya. What could we do? A person who is Caucasian, he is Jewish, he lives in Eretz Yisrael, doesn't have to be Messiah with an etzba of an Asian living in Vietnam or in China. He's Messiah looking at his own finger, and the finger has family members, the finger, the Rav's finger. Well, how are we supposed to be Messiah? So the Rosh Ephraim, Reb Zalman Margolis brings the Tashbetz. The Tashbetz says, when we have the stira, so in Tshuvas HaTashbetz he says, we go to Chumrah. Sefer Yovin Shmuel is another sefer of the Tashbetz. I never checked it. But Reb Zalman Margolis brings that the Yovin Shmuel says, we cannot be Meshai Bebeitzim because different species, are not the same size. And the Bais Ephraim says fingers are also not the same size. Different people have different fingers. And I don't know whether the Rosh Ephraim was aware that there are different races. So humankind is three different basic races. Yeshoimrim, those are Gimel B'nai Noach. But there are Negroids and the white man and the yellow man, the Asian, the African, the European. And they somewhat have different bills. So their voice might be different. So, L'choire Da'atei Sharoya is the most fundamental principle, and Da'atei Sharoya is Da'atei Sharoya, B'kol Mokim, and that is what the Shiurim are based on, and that is the Tshuvas HaGoinim. Mabitan Bis Yosef also found this discrepancy in a mikveh in Syria. So the Tashbits and the Mabit are basically the same. Tshuvas HaMashbet Chelek Al, Mabit, Chelek Al Semekuf Mem Gimel. And the Mabit writes, then when they measured the shiur of mikveh based on memsa, the number they got was kuf samach vav shamish. Shamish was obviously a unit of volume, a liquid volume unit. When they measured amor amma beroim gimel amis, they got 300, which is almost double, and it fits in with the tzlach. When the tzlach made the comparison in Chala, and the Mabit makes the same comparison in Mikveh, both say that the Shiur Etzbois is almost double. And that's 500 years ago. And it's interesting that they both come to the same dilemma. And I think what the Mabit says is clearly what I will teichef say. The Mabit says, when we have a steer in the course, the Tashbit says we go l'chumra. The Mabit says, Shiur Mikveh is Mayim Shekol Gufoi Oilo Behem. And therefore, the Shiur of Amma should overweigh the Shiur of Beitzin. Because how do you know Kol Gufoi Oilo Behem? We measure him, how tall, how wide, how fat. And we build a cube. So that is Amas. And therefore, the Shiur of Amas should be Kaveya, not the Shiur Beitzin. Actually, that is a Chumrah. So the Maskor of the Mabit fits in with the Tashbits. But the Mabit has a different argument. Not because we go to Chumrah. But, so Hanerer Laniyas Daiti. And that is the basic argument. And everything I said is an introduction to this point. La'aniyas Daiti. So the Gaonim are Marchiv, the Mishnah. And I want to be Marchiv, the Gaonim. What the Gaonim basically say is, Lo bichdi, kavu chazal fi beitzim v'zeisem, lo bichdi, ela b'chochma amuka. Because the only way to preserve Shiurim in their purity throughout the test of ages is Dvom Shebeteva. Any other measurement would cause confusion. We could never know what was an inch, what was a centimeter, what was a pint, what was a pound 1,000 years ago. So when Chazal spoke about Beitzim and Zeisim, it's not coincidence. It's B'chochma Amuka to preserve Shiurim throughout the ages, throughout the tests of time and space. And what I say is, כל הנוגע לשיעורי הנפח, הזייס והביצה שבכל דור ודור הוא השיעור. בכל הנוגע לשיעורי האורך, שיעורי האורך הם לפי דעתי שרויה. So, when we deal with Mechitzas Shabbos, Sora Tfochim, Tfanes HaSukkah, Zayin al Zayin, Oirech HaLulav, Dalet Tfochim, Tchum Shabbos Alpayim Amma, all these shiurim are etzba tefach amma, and we disregard gezayis kebetz. When we're dealing with achilas matzah and achilas moron and kiddush b'mokom suda and tumas oichlin, all we need to know is zayis and beitz and grogeres and koseves, and we disregard etzba v'amma. The dilemma is mikveh, and mikveh is not clear. Is volume or oirech. Mabit says clearly oirich, kol gufoi, odem beinani. So odem beinani, we just have to fix a model. How fat, how wide, how tall. So the Mabit says we disregard beitzim and we look at amos. So my opinion is that is also b'chlal da'atoi shel Roya. There is a discrepancy. So the Chazon Ish and Reb Chaim Noah want to be miyashiv discrepancy, and I say there's no need to be miyashiv, and we can't be miyashiv. We can't be miyashiv. Because how would we know? Maybe the amos changed as well. And if in time the beitzim nishtanu, probably the hens are different. They're bigger, they're smaller, they're different. So we do know that people were once taller, then they became shorter. The Chazon Ish says we can't say sheha omer va'etzba nisgadlu because people once were taller than today. If they were taller than today, then they should be niskatnu. And if they're also niskatnu, so what's the shiur? What's the shiur? As they were then or as they are now? So the moment you say that the shiurim change, or that the shiurim have to be the shiurim of then, and not the shiurim of today, so I don't understand the Chazon Ish. He says, if we want to be miyashiv this discrepancy, we can't say that ha'ama va'etzba gadlu, and we need the amma of then. No, because we're smaller than they were. If we are smaller than they were, then once again, it's not our etzba, it's their etzba. And how would we know what their etzba is? So the approach of the Chazon Ish is, as long as we don't have a stira, da'atoi shel Roya. And therefore, we don't have to be troubled. Maybe the etzba and the amma also changed. That doesn't have to trouble us. We just have to be reconciled the stira. And to be miyashiv the stira, it's more reasonable to say she'abeitzim katnu than say she'etzbot gadlu. Theoretically, it could be that the etzbot katnu, and then we have a problem. We don't have a problem because the Chazon Ish accepts da'atoi shel Roya, but not when we have a stira. And philosophically, this is very interesting. So the Chazon Ish tries to deal with the question. So was the Shulchan Aruch machshel esarabim? Was the Tosfos Yom Tov machshel esarabim? We proved that they had a mistake. Chazon Ish says, even if they had a mistake, but that is da'atoi shel Roya. But after the Grand, the Noidi Buddha Paskins, da'atoi shel Roya is the Noidi Buddha's eyes. Why? Because that is what the Gedolim said. The Rambam and many other early Rishonim say it is only Chazal that have this authority, Mesoiras HaTorah, Torah Shebal Peh, to say that everything changes al Yedei Noida B'Yehuda is a fabulous argument. Noida B'Yehuda was the Godel Ador, but it's not based on a Godel Shebelishkes Agosis Shehem Yesod HaTorah, like the Rambam writes in Hilchos Mamre. So the Noida B'Yehuda is the base Nagol Shivishleim, and why not the Minchas Baruch? I don't say the Minchas Baruch was as big as the Noida B'Yehuda, but that is the nature of Halacha. Why wouldn't the Tosfos Yom Tov be as reliable? Because the Tosfos Yom Tov didn't find the stira. As ma bekach Noida B'Yehuda matzah the stira. B'chol oifim. Even the D'Italia, I would say, da'atoi shel Roya is everything. And da'atoi shel Roya applies to Zeisim and Beitzim, it also applies to Etzba and Omo. There's a stira, let it be. So regarding Shiurei Oirech, that's Etzba and Omo, Shebekol L'Doyo V'Doyo. Regarding Shiurei Nefach, it's Zayis V'Beitzah, Shebekol L'Doyo V'Doyo. And because Beruach Kodsham Chazal maybe also knew that there will be discrepancies between the two systems. There will be. V'gam lezeh natnu da'atam. So the Chazon Ish and his contemporaries, l'shitosam, that we need to be miyashiv, and the halacha is determined by the teretz. say? So the Chazon Ish says, Shiurei Oma override Shiurei Nefach. Why? Because Shiurei Oma is fine, the Torah Shebechsav. Shiurei Nefach only in Torah Shebechsav. But Chazal are masmach Shiurei Nefach on Eretz Chitos Ha'oiro on a Pasuk. Yeah, but the Pasuk doesn't speak about the Shiur. Umadoisam chutz le'ir by Tchumen, the Pasuk says Amo. To me, that is not a very overpowering svara. Kula maroya echod nitnu. In Halacha Torah Shebal Peh is as powerful as Torah Shebechsav. Torah Shebechsav doesn't override Torah Shebal Peh. The Mesoros of Chazal is everything in Halacha. So the Stipler, I did not see it, but Rebbe Kiva told me, says, in the name of the Chazon Ish, when there's a stira, our problem is only with Beitzim, not with Zaysim. Zaysim is Data Sharia, Beitzim not. Why? Why? What does he explain? Where's Zayis Shir Torah? So Zayis, Krugeres, Kuseves, is the feet Data Sharia, only Beitz is different?
Beitz is the one that's a stira to Etzbais.
So when the Zayis is Soiset to Etzba, we are Kaveh Zayis. But when the Beitz is Soiset...
It's like the road. Shir Achilas Matzah Zayis, so Zayis Shokov, and then the Stipler says it's Chazon Ish Pasuk.
But the Mishnah Data Sharia clearly speaks about Beitz, and Beitz is Sha'amru.
Right, so you claim if that's Kollel, you don't find the stira. That's Chazon Ish Zayis.
Okay. The Chazon Ish is the Chazon Ish, and he is king. But Lani is deity, my Mahalach is more reasonable, and it fits in firmly with Shuvas HaGa'onim and all the Gedolei HaDoros that said a Zayis is a Zayis, and a Beitz is a Beitz, and a Grugeres is a Grugeres, and a Etzba is a Etzba. And so I wrote an additional Tosefes. I don't know whether I have time to go into detail, but was this given out in the Kollel? Okay. So this probably was not distributed in the Kollel because of my COVID. But I think it's very important. And what I wrote in this short Mahalach, and I think it should be distributed to the Yungalite, is the Rishonim already found stiras between Shiurei Grugeres, Beitz, and Zayis. And these are all Shiurei Nefach. So it's not only the discrepancies between one system and the other system, but within this system of Nefach, we are stiras. I will only stress the most obvious stira in Shulchan Aruch. So in Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Pei Vav, the Mechaber Paskins, that a Zayis is Chotzi Beitz. In Bais Yosef we find the Rambam Shlish Beitz, and the Mishnah Berurah brings it on the spot. Shulchan Aruch Paskins, Zayis is Chotzi Beitz. Shin Samaches, in Dinei Eruv. The Shir Eruv Chetzeres is Chai Groigeres, 18 Groigeres. Shehem Shesh Beitzim. Yesh Oimrim Shmoyne Beitzim. So a Groigeres is the third of a Beitzim. Shin Samaches. A Zayis is Chotzi Beitzim. But in Shabbos Sadik Aleph, it's a Gemor Mefereshes that a Zayis is smaller than a Groigeres. According to these two Seifim, a Zayis is bigger than a Groigeres. A Groigeres is a fig. Figs are bigger than olives. And that fits in with the Gemara in Shabbos Sadik Aleph. Zora kezayis lebayis hamenuga is a chayev shiur tzur Shabbos as Groigeres. So the Gemara says he wasn't moitzim mishus l'shus Groigeres, but a smaller shiur zayis. But the zayis was mashlim to oichel poches mikebeitze. So maybe it's chayev afilu an a kezayis. So it's a Gemara mefareshus Groigeres is bigger than a zayis. Tov Pevov, Shulchan Aruch Paskins Zayis is Chotzi Beitza. Shin Samaches, Yudches Groigeres are Shesh Beitza, which means a Groigeres is a third of a Beitza. How could it be? Gurgeres is supposed to be bigger than a Beitza. And this is a question Toisvis deals with, the Yumid of Pei, and Ecclesias Yudalid. And the Rishonim try to be Miyashiv, and all the Terusim and Rishonim, La Halacha, don't fit in with the Shulchan Aruch. Unless we say, and this is already extreme, that even within the Marechet, the system of Shiurei Nefach, Ein Lanu Elo Ma She'om Chacham. Shiur Matzah is Ezayis. And it's a Fizayis Bizmanenu, which they found to be a Chotzi Beitz. By Eruv, Shiur Gurgeres. And when they checked the Gurgeres Bizmaneim, it was Shlish Beitz. So even though, according to Chazal, Gurgeres is bigger than Azayis, and this is to take that Isharoya to an additional extreme. To an additional extreme. Because we're dealing with Shiurei Nefach. Therefore, it's a technicality. When Chazal say that Shiur Eruv is Chai Gurgeres, they might as well say Gimel Shesh Beitzim or Shmoyne Beitzim. Therefore, it's just a technicality. But maybe Halacha says, no. Maybe it was a technicality. But once it was said, it's a life of itself. It's no longer a technicality. It becomes a fixed shiur. What?
But the space that the Shulchan says it, because that's a bit.
Right. Yes. So, but the Shulchan Aruch also says that a Gurgeres is a Shlish Beitz. And the Gemara says as a Gurgeres is bigger than a Zayis. So, the Chayda we need to say, what Chazal were Kaveh Gurgeres is a Gurgeres L'Netzach. And Halacha that Chazal were Torah in a Zayis is a Zayis L'Netzach. And if the Gurgeres will shrink and the Zayis will be bigger than a Gurgeres, it would not change the Shiur, which is taking that Sharoya to additional extreme. An extreme I don't feel comfortable with. I feel totally comfortable with Perek Aleph. To say that the two systems, each of them is totally independent. But within the shiurim of Nefach, to say that because Chazal uttered the word Gurgeres, that is a Gurgeres L'Olam, and when they said Zayis, it's a Zayis L'Olam. So, L'Didi, Adayin Tzorech Yum Godol. That's my muskol. Adayin Tzorech Yum. But I think the shiur was very important, and my mahalach is a new mahalach and a new approach, which to me seems to be, I say, more reasonable. That's not convincing. Yosef Mistaver Tvei Kedarki. Shiurei Nefach nikba'u b'zeisim v'beitzim, Shiurei Oirech nikba'u b'etzba v'ama. And if there's a stira, let it be. And we do not change the basic halachas to reconcile the stira. Maybe the stira is impossible to reconcile. And that is what I learned both from the Tashbetz and from the Mabed. They were aware of a stira. And they suggest two different ways. The Mabed says l'chumra. No, the Mabed is Tashbetz. The Mabed, he doesn't give the cloud, but I think the Mabed says what I say, and he says by mikveh it is about size, and therefore we take the shiurei amo al amo and we disregard the shiur of memsa. So this is a very, very important matter.
The Shulchan says both shiur and the shiur for them being Beitz and the Chomish Beitz and Sheva it's boys.
Yeah, yes.
And
by mikveh the Shulchan Aruch also says both shiurim.
We still have a problem. That's what they.
Yes.
And if someone would make a kli with etzvos and take a little less and eat a challah, so according to the
So my approach is not miyashav this stira, but it is miyashav. It is a mahalach. So what are we supposed to do? Obviously, Bais Yosef wasn't aware of this stira. Obviously, he wasn't aware. But we find it tshuva nafka soicha. I don't know.
It just says Mediza is good.
I'm not clear what the After Sreichel argues that the ones that were Mishad and Beitzim just made a mistake.
It says not sure. It says Shlit. The water could have been heavier.
Yeah, he says they made a mistake. Okay, so Eile Devoreinu. I was asked to speak about Tisha B'Av, but I don't think we have time. Okay, Mehere Yibuna Beis Hamikdash. Yirotzam Lefonecha. שיבונה בייס המקדש במהרה וימינו ושכל כנו וסרוsecha ושם נעבודכו ויראו כי הם היולו וכשולם קדמוני אז we should be זויכה צוים הרביעי וצוים החמישי צוים השביעי וצוים העשירי יהיו לבייס יהודה לסוסוין ולשמחו ולמויד עם טויבם במהרה וימינו